Welcome to How to Write Good. I'm your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. At my website, you can find my book, The Ninth Hour, or you can check out my serialized novel, One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. Quick updates on a couple other projects I'm working on. I am done with rewrites for my book number 2. So book number 1 is The Ninth Hour, and book number 2 in that series is I'm done with the rewrites at this time. I don't know how long it's going to take my editing. I think that the timeline I have is going to be too short, but that's where I am with that. So that's really exciting. It's moving along. I have all the material that I'm going to use. My manuscript, if you want to call it that at this time, is about 300,000 words. So that is not going to be the that's not going to be how long the manuscript is going to be. It's like 250 to 300,000. For those of you who don't know, like a typical sci-fi book, a longer one is about 100,000. They get a bit longer, but that's where I'm at with that. Also, I have started planning on another project I'm working on that's not even related to anything else I'm working on. That is in the end, hopefully going to be going out to publishers, going to be going through the traditional route. So that's what's going on right now, and a couple updates with that. But yeah, so those of you who have read the first book, the second one is written but unedited, and editing takes a very long time, and editing is excruciating. I hate editing. I hate it. I love it. It's horrible. It's like, for me, I think some people hate certain things because they just hate them, But for me, editing is like exercising really hard. You're running or you're. I always had a thrill when I was a kid. I was in wrestling, and we'd do, gosh, what are they called? They're the sprints where you go from line to line to line. And how we'd work is that you had to do it. I think it was doing it for a certain amount of time, but everybody had to keep on going if people lagged behind. So you had to do even more. And at the same time, I hated it, but at the same time, there was a lot of a thrill. There was a thrill with that as well. And I think for editing, I hate editing. It's painful, but at the same time, there's a thrill that goes with editing as well. So yeah, check out The Ninth Hour. Check out One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. Hopefully, my hope is that by August, I will have book 2 out of the series, the In Memoriam series, which starts with The Ninth Hour. It's going to be, I don't know. It's hard to determine how long everything's going to take. I had a goal of getting everything typed up because I write everything by hand. I had a goal of getting everything typed up for that second book by the end of January, and I just finished it before the end of January. So that's, I just wanted to give a quick update on that because I forgot before, and I just wanted to make sure everybody knew, hey, this is what's coming out in the future. And hopefully in 2020, it'd be awesome if that second book came out in 2020. And of course, there's going to be Fleet chapters, One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. Those chapters will be coming out month by month as well. I don't see anything going behind in that. But my other project, the other book I'm writing, which I think is going to end up being like a thriller, I believe I'm going to be able to do planning for that. I might have a rough draft done by the end of the year for that, which is really cool. I don't know. I think it's interesting to see the process, especially if you're a newer writer. I know some of you are probably more veteran writers and you know how the process works. But if you're a newer writer, first of all, write as much as you can, write as often as you can. And if you have a lot of time, if you're a student, if you're younger, use that time, write a lot if that's what you want to do, because you're going to be leagues ahead of people who didn't take the time and practice it. Because you might write something terrible. Everybody writes something terrible. Everybody has something that has a lot of flaws, and it shows that they're not very good at what they do. And then they eventually get better and better and better, and they become capable. Our word of the week is analyze. So analyze. Now, I'm going to give you the definition I found. It's study and determine the relationship of the parts. But when I learned about analysis in the past, and you don't learn about this often, one thing that frustrates me about classrooms, not every classroom, but one thing that does frustrate me about classrooms is that teachers don't often define what they're talking about. So I went into a lot of classes about education. I had a lot of education classes and pedagogy and all that, those big words that don't mean much. But they always talked about, you analyze this thing. We need to have the kids. If you look at Common Core standards, which, if you're going through education courses, if you've been in that world, you look at the Common Core standards, you're trying to line up you're trying to see those Common Core standards, figure out at least this is how I worked, you figure out what the core of that standard is. you figure out what the essence of that standard is, what they're actually asking me to do. And then you try to line up what you're teaching, and you try to go along that to a certain degree, especially when you're in school. It probably changes to a certain degree once you're in a school and teaching. But when you're in school and you're the student, you're actually trying to flesh out those standards. You're trying to figure out what they mean. So I ran into this word analysis or analyze, and I'm like, what does that mean? And people threw it around in classrooms. You need to analyze this, analyze that. We'll do an analysis, etc. And I'm like, well, nobody's actually saying what that means. Nobody knows what that means. So I looked into it. I'm like, okay, what does analyze mean? Because I don't want to talk about something without actually understanding what I'm saying. And analyze, what I found is you're taking something apart to understand it. If you might say, and maybe this is going too far with the use of the word, that I'm analyzing the anatomy of something by dissecting it. I'm taking it apart piece by piece. I'm seeing how everything fits together. If you're analyzing a vehicle, you could analyze different parts of a vehicle. You could analyze the design, right? You could analyze how the engine is put together, and different things like that. You could analyze how comfortable everything is in the car, but to do that, you need to pull it apart, right? You can't actually analyze whether an engine is sophisticated or good unless you're pulling it apart, at the very least in your mind. And I think that's what we're typically doing. So analysis, or analyzing something, is looking at it, taking it apart in your mind so you can understand it better. You can understand the relationship of the parts to one another to understand it more fully. And then you can actually learn more about that thing because you've done that. So if you walk into a situation, it might actually benefit you to be like, okay, let's actually analyze this. Let's actually go according to the definition. Let's take this thing apart, at the very least in our minds, and look at it and determine how it works, how things work in relation to one another, and then we'll go forward with it. So that is our word of the week, analyze. One more time, study and determine the relationship of the parts. Our accidental essence is actually about analysis as well. Okay, this podcast episode is about analyzing stories. And if I understood what the actual analysis of stories was better when I was younger, aka high school, because when you're in college, they say they're giving you a liberal arts degree. Okay, my side note about college. So the traditional liberal arts degree is very useful in the development of yourself as a person, right? The college has morphed from a place where you get educated in the liberal arts, which are the art, the literature, the culture of your civilization, and it shifted toward trade school. Actually, it shifted. That's what's happened, and the reason why that's happened, from what I see, I might not have all the factors. I believe that college has shifted from something where you go and you get educated in the culture of your country, your civilization. I believe it shifted from that toward trade school because everybody goes to college now. Most people don't really care about all the different cultural aspects that were part of college. They care about being able to get a skill and get a job. And I don't blame them because having a job, having a career is a huge part of life. And so it shifted toward those things. And because it shifted and so many people have degrees, therefore a lot of employers are like, well, you need a degree for this, even though you probably don't for a lot of things. For example, you do not need a degree for journalism. I don't see the point. I think you can learn that on the job. I don't think that it's something extremely, unbelievably sophisticated. It's not like a doctor where you have this catalog of information in your mind. It's not like a lawyer where it's similar. It's not like an engineer. And even with an engineer, you might be able to learn that on the job if you started with a lower job and they're like, hey, you have a lot of potential. Let's teach you how to do this thing. So there's a lot of jobs, and you could probably do that with most jobs. You could probably do that with a lawyer and probably do that with a doctor as well if you restructured everything. So there's a lot of jobs, though, that you could walk out of school, or you could walk out of high school, and if you're an intelligent enough person with enough gumption, if we want to use that word, you could walk into that job and you could be just fine. Or you could walk into a job that's two or three tiers lower. You could work up to that job and you'd be making money and you would have a lot more experience. But the typical idea used to be that you would get educated in the culture, Western culture. Okay, now it's turned into trade school, and because Western culture has been poo-pooed upon in the last 40 years, probably sooner than that actually. In the last 40 years, but even more so in the academy, it's been poo-pooed upon in the last decade at the very least. Because of that, there's been a turn away from teaching the classics of Western culture, and there's been a turn toward teaching everything else. I don't really know the focus, honestly. If you're going to have a liberal arts degree, as it's traditionally been known, are those classics in Western culture. It's literature, it's music, it's art, etc., and it's creating a well-rounded person. But how it works now is there's all these things you have to take, right? You have to take your generals, and people take them because they have to. I mean, that's pretty much how everybody goes through the school. People take them because they don't see the value in them, because the actual culture isn't taught in the same way it used to be taught, or maybe it never was taught. The actual culture isn't taught. The reason why, the justification for teaching liberal arts isn't taught, okay? But people say, oh yeah, I'm just getting this degree because this degree gives me a bigger paycheck when I get out. So there's been a shift toward people not needing to do as much work in that liberal arts foundation and moving toward a degree that actually makes them money, which I don't blame them. If you have to pick between art and literature and culture in general, and you have to pick between that and eating, I'm going to pick eating over over the former. And I think most people will. So you can definitely disagree with me about that. From what I'm seeing, that's how it works. But if I would have known how to analyze a story, and if I would have been taught in a realistic way about analysis of stories when I was younger, I may have been less belligerent. I was a belligerent student in terms of literature. I didn't really complain about anything else, but I was always pushing against English teachers and literature teachers when it came to the literature, because my mindset when I was younger is like, well, I don't see this in the story whatsoever. And it might have been just the case that you're stupid. If you're 16 years old, you're not going to see as much as someone who's 25 or 30 or 40 or 50. But I didn't understand. I didn't see how, or I was big into writing back then as well, and I was big into reading, and I was big into understanding stories, and I was big into the craft of storytelling and big into the craft of writing. And when I read a story, I would say, well, I don't see the some things I loved a lot, but there were some of them that I would be like, well, I don't see the point of this. But at the same time, there were things pointed out in the story. So, for example, and I make fun of this now, and I've talked about this in the past. One of my literature teachers, he was a great teacher, by the way, nothing against him. He was a great teacher. He talked about how there was a specific color in the story and represented a certain thing. The author was trying to convey a certain thing based on this one color. And I'm like, okay, that's stupid. Because it's super simplistic. I'm going to have a color, and therefore, because I have this color, even if my writing sucks, it's going to convey this deep meaning, and we should look toward this and find wisdom in this color. It's very simplistic, and I don't really like it, and I don't think it's something that, first of all, I don't think that's how art works, right? So, if you were my junior year literature teacher, I'm not going to say your name because you deserve your privacy. I don't think that's how literature works at all. I don't think that's how good literature works. I think somebody who is not a good writer and not a good storyteller and who is someone who's trying to make a piece of art but isn't good at it, they're going to put something together like that. But I don't think that's how literature works. I don't think that's what we're looking for in literature. Another thing you pointed out is in The Great Gatsby, and I think this isn't really stupid. Maybe it isn't as stupid as I thought it was back then. I haven't read The Great Gatsby since high school. One thing that he pointed out is, you have these these eyeglasses on the hill, and it's looking over this desolation, right? It's looking over this crappy part of town, and these are the eyes of God, and they're looking at all the trash that is what's going on in the upper class, and that's what that's the teacher's like, oh yeah, and this is a great symbolism here. I'm like, yeah, but if I was 12 years old, I could make up symbolism like that. I think it goes beyond that. And when I was younger, and I've gone pretty far and I've changed my mind to a certain degree, but it's still in the same general idea. When I was younger, I'm like, well, why can't we just read the story and understand it how it's written, and why do we have to read into it so much? And I still believe that, actually. I don't think that if there's something that isn't said in the story, if there's something that's put into the story that is artistic liberty, for example, the eyeglass billboard in, I think it's a billboard, the eyeglass billboard in The Great Gatsby, if that's in the story, but there's nothing happening, or there's nothing to justify saying, oh, this is what it means, then we shouldn't talk about it. Now, in The Great Gatsby, there was something to justify it. I just thought it was stupid symbolism. Like, it's just like, oh, what should I put? Oh, why don't I put a big, huge pair of eyeglasses? Glasses. I don't know how I need to say eyeglasses. And so I thought it was stupid. And there's other ways to do it. When we approach the analysis of a story, I don't think that's what we should be doing. Okay. How I think we should approach the analysis of a story goes back to what I thought when I was younger, which was we should look at what the author is actually telling, right? We should look at the story itself. And the author can make the story and make the art deeper, maybe not deeper, but make the art more complex by adding certain things. For example, the eyeglasses, and if there were other things as well, the artist could add those as well. But I don't think that's the core, and I don't think that's what we should be looking at. And if we want to teach younger people about stories, and if we want to teach them to analyze stories, I think we have to have a different approach, because you're going to have that kid like me who says, this is stupid, this doesn't make any sense. I was just going back to what made sense, right? And it didn't make sense to me to read into a story in that way, because what I could do, this is one of the reasons, this is probably the biggest reason, the reason why I didn't think that was good, is because I could look at one little detail, and I could take that little detail and I could expand it across the entire story. And I could say, oh, the story means this because look at this detail, right? Because storytelling is more than one detail. If you're a writer, you know this. Art is more than one detail. Art is a cohesive unit. So we need to understand it as a cohesive unit, and we need to think of it like that. What makes it it makes it more difficult to analyze, because we have to think of it in its entirety rather than saying, oh, here's one little tiny piece. Looking at it as looking at little tiny pieces within an artistic project, within writing, looking at little details the artist puts in there can either be, if you're a good artist, you're probably trying to pick specific details for specific reasons, right? But if we look at a little detail, it is either easier to take that little detail and extrapolate it into something that doesn't actually make sense, or something that the writer's not trying to say, even though the writer's not necessarily trying to say anything. I'll get to that in a moment. If we do that, I think we can go astray more easily. So when we look at any artistic piece, we need to look at the whole artistic piece. It's kind of like, this might make more sense. If I'm reading a story, I don't read half the story, set down the book, and say that book stinks, right? I can't analyze whether the value of that book if I don't read the whole thing. I need to actually read the whole thing. Okay, there might be, the beginning of the story might be really slow, but the slowness of the beginning might be justified by the end of the story. Okay, and that could be, and there could be a lot of different things in the story that are justified by the end of the story. And because you understand that whole storyline, you actually like the book. You see the value, the artistic value in that book. So the first question we got to ask, because this is what literature teachers are getting at, is, do stories have meaning? And the answer to that clearly is yes. Okay, words have meaning, and stories are told in a specific way. And even though when you read a story and you understand this, like, even though when you experience the story as a whole, you might not understand everything about that story, it has meaning because it's conveying meaning to you in this like amorphous thing. It's conveying meaning to you like a cloud of meaning, right? You can't take it in all at once. when you go through life, there are experiences have meaning, right? Okay, experiences in your life have meaning, and I'm not talking about like this experience is leading me here, but we go through life, we experience something, we react to it emotionally. There's a feeling inside of us. We connect it back to core values. We connect it back to other thoughts, other ideas we have. We change our minds because of these experiences. It doesn't have meaning in the same way as me saying that you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? The golden rule has a very specific meaning. Sentences have very specific meanings. Stories have more of a cloud of meaning, okay? They're not conveying this statement necessarily. They're not conveying a statement in the same way that some people would think they would be. They're actually conveying they're conveying an experience, right? That the meaning they're conveying is the experience that's going on. So yes, they have meaning. They have meaning on the surface. So the meaning on the surface is that storyline. It's that thing that you experience in the moment and over the course of a time. I really like books because you don't experience them in one moment. You actually experience them in kind of like temporal layers or something like that. But they do have meaning. So on the surface level, like I said, it's just the basic idea that, we read this book, we enjoy the story, we understand that it is a story, we understand the beats of the story, we understand the dialogue, etc. And then each story actually says something about the world. Okay, whether it could be something that what is said about the world could be correct, what is said about the world could be incorrect, and stories say not just one. They usually have one big thing they're saying about the world. We call these themes, but they're saying a lot of different things about the world. Okay, and like I said, stories can either be saying something correct about the world or incorrect about the world, or there could be this middle ground. And I always go back to this idea that stories are based on the subjective experience of humans, of individuals, and because their subjective experience of humans, of the individual. We could have a story that is saying something that is true to the experience of that person and still not line up with how reality actually works. And there actually is value in that, okay? So I'm not saying there's value in truthfulness and truth itself. Okay, and I've talked about this in the past. I've talked about how if we try to be truthful in our writing, if we try to match up with reality, if we try to convey something that people can experience in a truthful way, we are going to be more likely to get to truth in the end, bigger truths about ourselves, and the audience will get to bigger truths about themselves and the world, etc. But it could be the correct or not. Some people are just going to write a story, and their story, if you're writing, this is one of the reasons why you don't write to serve your political agenda, because if you're writing and you're trying to just reach out and touch truthfulness, you're trying to get as close to the truth as possible based on your own experiences, it's like you're someone who might be confused, but you're telling the truth, or you're trying to tell the truth. If you're someone who is basing it off an ideology, you're not even trying to find what even feels true. You're not even trying to get closer to the truth, just as if you're a blind person, which writing often is like. There's that parable, I guess, about the blind men. They're all feeling parts of an elephant, and they're like, it's like a snake because they're feeling the tail, or I don't know, a rope because they're feeling the tail, or it's like a snake because they're feeling the trunk. It's like a tree because they're feeling the leg of the elephant. Well, they're not correct about what the elephant is like completely, but they're correct in part. And if you're someone who is feeling your way forward, and you're trying to figure out, okay, what is true to what the reality that I actually know, what is true to reality that's going to resonate with people, then you're going to probably do a better job than someone who's trying to push a specific agenda. This is why books that have they have an overt political ideology don't do as well. They're not as good of works of art in general as books that don't. Right? There's political ideology in books. There's books that aren't politically ideological. There's political ideology in very good books. This is why there's some books that are written just because there's a religious paradigm, and those books don't come out as good as the ones that were written to try to be as close to reality as possible, because the person with the religious paradigm always had to shove the religious paradigm in the way they thought that it worked. Now, as someone who's a Christian, I think the religious paradigm fits within the world. I just think that it doesn't fit the way if someone isn't a writer or someone isn't making art, I don't think the religious paradigm fits into the world in such a clean way as some people think it does, if that makes sense. What can be conveyed through storytelling is whether the world is just or unjust. Does hard work pay off? Is being a good person worth it? I would say that if you're looking at themes, one thing to remember about themes is that themes come across as a statement about something. They're a value statement about something. So if I think that a specific type of person is bad, if I'm racist, I'm like, that group of people is bad. That group of people isn't as good as another group of people. Well, I'm conveying my racism through what I'm writing, and I'm going to present that group as not as good. And I think this happened in older literature throughout the world. Racism is definitely something that is inside every single culture. Actually, it used to be the norm, if you think about it, because every culture was attacking. It wasn't racism necessarily. It wasn't like, oh, that's a race and that's a race. But I guess it would be xenophobia was a thing that existed in all forms throughout the world. You looked and you're like, hey, look at those people across the river who aren't part of our tribe. Well, we can't have them around. That's really simplistic, but it did happen. The Hatfields and Mccoys is actually it's about that in a way. It's about how you just have hatred for another group because of the fact that that group is different than you. That group is not your group, therefore you're going to hate them. You're going to keep this feud going. You need revenge on that group. And it's a good analog for what racism is. It makes no sense. It hurts both sides, and it's just there for no reason. It's inherent in you. It's in your bloodline, literally. So when you look at a story, you are looking at the individual pieces to take it apart, right? You're analyzing. You want to look at the individual pieces, but when we're analyzing a story, we want to understand how the story is affecting us, right? How the story is affecting us, but how things change within the story. When you look at video games, or when you look at board games as well, there's specific rules in board games, and there's specific rules in video games. Most video games are three-dimensional, some aren't, but most of them have a physics engine of some type. So from what I understand, a physics engine is mathematical equations to say, hey, this is how things interact in this three-dimensional space we've created for our video game. And within board games, board game rules make more sense because it's like, oh, you can do this in your game and you can do that in your game and you can't do this. Well, maybe it's easier to understand literature in the same way. So when we're looking at a book, the author has specific rules in their mind, right? The author says, okay, this is reality. And these aren't things they're trying to, most of the time, these aren't things they're trying to push. These aren't things that they're like, this is how reality works, and therefore this is how everything has to play out in the book. These are things that are innate. They're coming out of their biases. They're coming out of their paradigms. They're coming out of their ideas that they hold close to themselves. They're coming out of their viewpoints on the world and how the world works. And when we look at that, there's value if it's put together well, right? If there's a book and it's trash, it's put together poorly, and it's telling lies, there's not as much value in that as a book that's put together well, and the author has these closely held beliefs, but these beliefs are incorrect, okay? But what we need to look for is how do things play out in the book? And that's why I go back to things like, is the world just? Well, for some authors, it might not seem like the world is just, right? So Van Gogh wrote a book. Van Gogh might be like, the world sucks. Van Gogh killed himself, okay? And he killed himself before Van Gogh's very famous, but he became very famous after he died. Talk about a just world, right? So Van Gogh probably would write a book about that's more on the darker side of things. I would say that a lot of Edgar Allan Poe's things do not present the world as just. They present a dark world. There's some writers, there's some storytellers who present a brighter future, a brighter world, such as Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek, who essentially created like a utopia. Star Trek was this future we could look forward to that was hopeful and hope-filled. And then you have other people who create a darker future that is not as hope-filled. I would say that Firefly isn't as hope-filled. It's more grounded in what we'd consider reality, even though reality is really multifaceted. But I think all these have value, but we need to look, okay, how are they presenting everything? What stories are they telling? What ideas are they bringing up? Why are they bringing up those ideas? We're looking at all these different parts, and we're not trying to just focus on little tiny details. We're trying to focus on bigger things in the story. Does the hero succeed, right? In Star Wars, imagine in that original trilogy if Luke didn't succeed. Imagine if Darth Vader did not get redeemed, how different that story would be. At the end, you'd be like, man, we won, but like he wasn't able to get his father back. But at the same time, what is that story telling in Star Wars? Well, that story is telling that there is redemption even for the person who's strayed the most. And that's a really hopeful story, right? There's a bigger story being told as well, that good triumphs over evil, even if evil is the one that seems to be winning, even if evil seems to be the one that's in power. A small person who is good can triumph over a huge evil. That's what was going on. It also told stories about more of like a religious aspect to society in Star Wars. There was the Force, and the Force is a religious thing going on. And there's this idea within Star Wars that, maybe even though there's all these, if you watch Star Wars, one of the reasons why people loved it is because it was a lived-in world, because it seemed real, but at the same time there was this mystical aspect to it. And maybe George Lucas was paralleling this idea that we live in this real world, we live in this dirty, grungy place, we live in a world with all these little details, we are grounded in this reality, but at the same time there's this magic that we just don't understand. There's these things about us, these things about the world that we don't understand. But yeah, so you have to look at like what type of world's being presented, whether it's dark, whether it's light, whether it's topsy-turvy, whether it's just a big, huge joke. So what's his name? Terry Pratchett is going to be a different read than 1984, than George Orwell, right? How the tone is completely different, because Terry Pratchett's very tongue-in-cheek, and 1984 is very dark and ominous, and you just want to curl up in a ball and cry after you're done reading the book. But when you're looking at that, it's easy to, one word of caution, then I'm going to be done because I'm a little over. One word of caution is that we want to actually tell the story the author is trying to intend to tell. We don't want to stray from what the author wanted to tell, or we don't want to stray from the what the author's actually conveying. So that's what becomes difficult, and that's when we're looking at something, our own biases and paradigms can actually shift how we understand a story. And this is why storytelling and analysis of stories is very good and important, is because it actually can change how we think. And it doesn't necessarily change our closely held beliefs, right? So if you believe in a God, you might not have your idea of there being no God. You might not suddenly become an atheist. But it might be the case that you understand the atheist's view because you've experienced that view. You're like, yeah, I get why somebody would believe in that. In the same way, if you're an atheist, you might understand why someone might believe in a God wholeheartedly. Both sides believing it wholeheartedly. And you're like, yeah, I understand that. So I think that's one of the aspects that's very important. I actually think that might be the most important aspect to literature or art in general. I mean, art is a constant question on my mind of what it is, what's the purpose of it, how it interacts with us in the world. But one of the reasons why art might be so important, the reason why it might be so important, is because it connects us together. So we might be looking at things that tear us apart that are considered artistic, and we might say, well, maybe that isn't art. Maybe that actually shouldn't qualify as good art. But that's just a question for another time. But again, when we look back at it, we're trying to find those big ideas. We're not looking at those little details. We want to get to the heart of what the author's trying to say, what this author presents us, because this author has value. Good art has value. Good literature has value. Analyzing good literature has value. And I wouldn't have said that 10 years ago, but here I am saying it now. Congratulations, you got to the end of my podcast. So you either had to listen to my voice, or you had to listen to my voice and watch my face, which I don't envy you. Let's just say that. But if you're someone who likes this podcast and you're thinking, I'd like to support him in this podcast or the other creative things he's doing, creative things I'm doing, there's a few things you can do, because some people don't know what they can do to support people who create stuff. So these are the few things you can do that will really, really help me. First of all, check out my website. Check out the other things I'm doing. Second, comment on things, share them, like them, subscribe. Subscribe if you haven't already. And the third thing you can do is give reviews on different places, all right? So the biggest thing for this podcast is going on to iTunes, giving it an honest review, telling people why you like it, telling people why you hate my voice, why you hate my face, but telling people why they should really check it out, despite the fact that I have so many failings in terms of looks and voice. Other than that, if you want to check out my books, grab a copy of the book and listen to the serialized novel. Give digital copies away. That's a really big thing too. I always want to give you something that is valuable to you. I always want to give someone listening to this podcast something that's going to stick with them, or a book that they can actually own. And you can own that book for very, very cheap. So go check that out on Amazon. The different things I said: subscribe, upvote, comment, share, and definitely give it a review on iTunes. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.